All right, welcome to another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today's topic is one that I think a lot of people are going to find really interesting. We're diving into the life of Empress Elizabeth of Austria,
Hmm.
better known to many as Sissi, or sometimes Sissy. And we're going to be pulling from the Wikipedia page that you guys sent in for this one. Now, going beyond just the basic biographical details,
Right.
we really want to unpack, I think, what made Elizabeth such a compelling figure. What shaped her personality? What was it like to live in that Habsburg court?
The Hofburg.
The Hofburg, exactly, that main imperial palace in Vienna. And, what kind of lasting impact did she have? Because her life, spanning from 1837 to 1898, right in the middle of some pretty huge shifts in Europe, there's a lot to uncover.
Yeah, absolutely. A period of immense change, both politically and socially. And Elizabeth's life really intersects with all of that.
It really does.
I mean, starting with her upbringing, which for a future empress was remarkably unconventional, to say the least. She was born Duchess Elizabeth Amalie Eugenie in Bavaria in 1837, and her childhood was anything but typical.
Yeah, I mean, just picture it, right? Her dad, Duke Maximilian Joseph, he kind of had this thing for the unusual. Loved circuses and much preferred their summer residence, Possenhofen Castle. They'd escape the formality of the court and just, have their own little world there.
Absolutely. Possenhofen was their haven, a place where they could shed the constraints of court life. And Elizabeth, along with her siblings, they had a very free, unstructured upbringing. There's this emphasis on her love for horseback riding, often even skipping lessons to indulge in it.
Yeah. So she's kind of like this free spirit, riding around, very independent, a little rebellious even. That must have been a huge contrast when she suddenly found herself thrust into the hyper-formal Habsburg court.
It's hard to imagine a greater shift. That lack of formal training in court etiquette, in all the intricacies of protocol, it must have made her transition to life at the Hofburg incredibly difficult.
Oh, yeah.
Someone who's accustomed to such freedom, suddenly having to adhere to these strict rules, the constant scrutiny,
Always being watched.
always being watched. And then, of course, there's the whole story of how she ended up marrying Emperor Franz Joseph I. It's a tale of, unexpected turns, a bit like a fairy tale,
Oh,
almost.
yeah. His mother, Archduchess Sophie, she had a very different plan in mind.
Oh, completely. She had her sights set on her niece, Helene, who was Elizabeth's older sister. The idea was for Franz Joseph to propose to her during a gathering in Bad Ischl in 1853. And Elizabeth, she was there too, but almost as an afterthought.
Yeah, kind of like, oh, and bring Sissy along too.
Exactly. She was mourning a recent loss and, feeling a bit down. Her mother thought a change of scenery might help.
Yeah, maybe left her spirits a
Yep.
little.
And maybe, just maybe, she might even take a liking to the emperor's younger brother, Archduke Karl Ludwig. But fate, it seems, had other plans in store.
Talk about a twist of fate, right?
Sure.
And it's fascinating how these little details, these almost accidental happenings, they can completely change the course of history. Like their arrival in Bad Ischl, it was delayed,
Yeah.
and their formal gowns, Boston Transit. So they end up meeting the young emperor dressed in mourning black because the Bavarian court was, in a period of mourning.
And while black might not have been the most flattering color for Helene, it apparently accentuated Elizabeth's youthful beauty. She was only 15 at the time, and the emperor, well, he was instantly smitten.
He's over heels.
He completely defied his mother's wishes, declaring that he wouldn't marry at all if he couldn't marry Elizabeth. Just 5 days later, they were engaged.
5 days.
And within 8 months, the wedding took place in Vienna. It was a whirlwind romance.
I can't even imagine. And her dowry, by the way, was a pretty hefty sum.
Oh, yeah, substantial. It was the equivalent of about US $240,000 today.
240,000 in 2015 dollars. Think about that.
That's a considerable fortune. And it all happened so fast. I mean, going from this relatively relaxed life to the most intense formal court in Europe. How do you think a young Elizabeth dealt with that kind of a change?
I mean, it must have been an absolute shock to the system. And, the sources describe her as being quite shy, introverted.
Yeah, by nature.
So to suddenly be in this environment where you're constantly observed, judged, every move you make is analyzed.
Every word.
It's no wonder that her health started to suffer. Within weeks of arriving, she was having these coughing fits, anxieties, especially in enclosed spaces like narrow staircases.
It's almost claustrophobic just thinking about it.
And then, on top of all that, she becomes a mother very quickly. And that brought its own set of challenges, right?
Oh, absolutely. And a lot of those challenges stemmed from her, shall we say, formidable mother-in-law.
Archduchess Sophie.
Archduchess Sophie, exactly. Just 10 months after the wedding, Elizabeth gave birth to her first daughter, Sophie Friederich. And the Archduchess, well, she basically took over.
Took over completely.
She named the child without even consulting Elizabeth, and she took complete control of the baby's care. Elizabeth wasn't even allowed to breastfeed or
Oh.
really have any say in how her daughter was raised.
So she's an empress, but she's not even allowed to be a mother to her own child.
It highlights the power dynamics at play. In the Habsburg court, tradition and hierarchy reigned supreme. And Elizabeth, as a young, relatively inexperienced empress, well, she just didn't have the authority to stand up to someone like Archduchess Sophie.
No, not at that point.
And this pattern continued. When her second daughter, Gisela, was born a year later, the Archduchess again took control.
So it's not just one baby, it's both of her children that she's basically separated from.
And on top of all of this, there was the immense pressure to produce a male heir. And to add insult to injury, there's this account of a malicious pamphlet that appeared on Elizabeth's desk.
Oh, yeah, that's a nasty one.
It basically implied that her only value was in bearing sons, and that a queen who doesn't have sons is a dangerous foreigner.
What a horrible thing to say.
And although it's not definitively proven, it's widely believed that Archduchess Sophie was behind it. It really speaks volumes about the atmosphere Elizabeth was dealing with.
It was toxic.
It really was. However, amidst all of this, there are glimmers of Elizabeth asserting herself. During their travels in Italy, she managed to persuade Franz Joseph to grant amnesty to some Italian political prisoners.
So she did have some influence when she chose to use it.
Exactly. It shows that even in those early, difficult years, she had her own convictions and she wasn't afraid to act on them. And then there's her first visit to Hungary in 1857. This seems to have been a turning point for her.
A real pivotal moment.
The contrast between the formality of the Austrian court and let's say the more aristocratic independence she found in Hungary, it really made a lasting impression on her.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, right? You have this young woman who grew up with a certain degree of freedom, and then she's thrown into this very rigid, suffocating environment. So to encounter a culture that values independence, that's less about rules and more about spirit, it must have resonated with her deeply.
Absolutely. She wasn't just an empress there. She was embraced in a different way. She developed this deep affection for the Hungarian people and their culture, and they, in turn, absolutely adored her. She dedicated herself to learning Hungarian, and the sources note how years later her picture was still prominently displayed in Hungarian homes.
Yeah, it's really a love story between Elizabeth and the Hungarian people.
It's beautiful, but unfortunately this trip to Hungary, it also brought immense tragedy.
Yeah, it's a real roller coaster of emotions.
Both of her young daughters fell ill during the trip. While Gisela recovered, her 2-year-old daughter, Sophie, sadly passed away, most likely typhus. It was devastating for Elizabeth. It exacerbated her existing melancholic tendencies, leading to severe depression. And sadly, it seems she also withdrew emotionally from her surviving daughter, Gisela. It just shows the immense personal toll that she was carrying.
It's a reminder that behind the facade of royalty, there were very real, very human struggles.
Absolutely. But then amidst the grief comes hope again. In December of 1857, Elizabeth became pregnant once more.
And this time, the stakes were high.
Oh, they were. The pressure to produce a male heir was immense. And in August of the following year, she gave birth to Crown Prince Rudolph.
Finally, a son.
The birth of a son significantly elevated her standing within the court, and her influence grew.
It's almost like she finally had a bargaining chip,
In a way, yes. And her deepening understanding of Hungary also placed her in a unique position. She became this crucial intermediary between the Hungarians and the emperor, advocating for their interests, trying to bridge the gap.
She found a purpose, a role that went beyond just being the emperor's wife.
Absolutely. Her interest in politics, her liberal views, particularly her support for the Hungarian cause, it all came to the forefront. And then there's her relationship with Count Gyula Andrassy. There were rumors of a romantic involvement, but regardless, their connection was undeniable.
Yeah, he seems to have been a very important figure in her life.
He was, and she was a fierce advocate for him. She pushed for his appointment as the premier of Hungary, even challenging Franz Joseph directly on this issue. The sources describe her pleas as, quite forceful.
Really gonna bat for him.
She saw him as the key to a political compromise that could benefit both Austria and Hungary. And her efforts, they weren't in vain.
No, they weren't.
They played a significant role in the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867, which essentially created the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. This was a major political achievement, and Elizabeth was at the heart of it.
It's a testament to her political acumen, her ability to to navigate those complex dynamics.
Absolutely. And as a result of this compromise, Franz Joseph and Elizabeth were crowned King and Queen of Hungary in June of 1867.
Double the crowns.
And as a coronation gift, Hungary presented them with a beautiful country residence in Gödöllő, a symbol of their connection, their shared history.
Yeah, I mean, it's beautiful. It's almost like a fairy tale ending.
It is. But of course, with Elizabeth, things are never quite that simple. The following year, while spending a considerable amount of time in Hungary, she gave birth to her fourth child, Marie Valerie. She became known as the Hungarian child, and Elizabeth was determined to raise her herself.
No more Archduchess Sophie interfering.
Exactly. It was a clear sign that Elizabeth had, carved out some autonomy, both politically and personally. But her marriage to Franz Joseph, well, it remained complex.
Yet even with all the political victories and her connection with Hungary, her personal life, it wasn't a smooth sailing.
No, it wasn't. Franz Joseph, he was deeply in love with her, that's clear. But their personalities, their approaches to life, they were fundamentally different.
Like oil and water.
In a way, yes. He was conservative, a man of tradition, a stickler for court ceremony. Elizabeth, on the other hand, well, she became increasingly restless, introverted, emotionally distant. They just operated on different wavelengths.
Kind of a classic clash of personalities, isn't it?
It really is. And Elizabeth's way of coping with this, with the pressures of court life, was to travel extensively.
Basically run away.
In a sense, yes. She sought refuge in travel, fleeing Vienna and her imperial duties whenever she could. It led to these long periods of separation from her husband and children. But interestingly, during these later years, their correspondence actually increased, and their relationship, according to sources, it evolved into a warmer, more understanding friendship.
Almost like absence made the heart grow fonder.
Perhaps. Distance allowed them to connect in a different way. And during these years, Elizabeth also developed some rather unusual habits. She slept very little, often spending her nights reading and writing. She even took up smoking, which was quite scandalous for a woman of her status at the time.
Shocking, really.
It was, and it probably fueled the court gossip mill even more. Intellectually, she was incredibly curious. She developed a strong interest in history, philosophy, and literature, and she had a particular fascination with the poet Heinrich Heine. She even collected his letters.
Quite the bibliophile.
And she wasn't just a consumer of words, she was a creator as well. She wrote poetry, Heine-inspired poetry, under the pseudonym Titania.
Titania, that's a great pseudonym.
It is, a nod to Shakespeare's Queen of the Fairies. Her poetry was a private outlet, a sort of secret diary where she could express her thoughts and feelings freely.
Yeah, that makes sense. A way to escape the confines of her public role, to explore her inner world.
The themes she wrote about, they often revolved around her travels, classical Greek and romantic imagery, and sometimes there's the subtle, even ironic commentary on the Habsburg dynasty itself. There's that beautiful line, "O'er thee, like thine own seabirds, I'll circle without rest. For me, earth holds no corner to build a lasting nest." It perfectly captures her restless spirit, her feeling of being perpetually on the move.
Always searching, never quite finding that place to land.
Exactly. And beyond her artistic inclinations, she also had this rather unexpected interest in the treatment of the mentally ill.
Yeah, that one kind of surprised me. Like, for her Saint's Day wish in 1871, she asked for a fully equipped lunatic asylum.
It's an unusual request for a royal, to say the least. It suggests a sensitivity to human suffering that went beyond the typical concerns of her social class.
Right. Maybe it stemmed from a personal experience.
Yeah.
Or perhaps just a genuine intellectual curiosity about psychology, which was a growing field of study at the time.
It's hard to say for sure, but it does add another layer to this complex figure. And then, of course, we come to the Mayerling incident in 1889.
The tragedy that really overshadowed the rest of her life.
It was a turning point. The death of her only son, Rudolf, by suicide, alongside his lover, Mary Witzera.
It's unimaginable.
The sources say that Elizabeth never truly recovered from this loss. She withdrew even further, retreated into melancholy. And in the years that followed, she faced a series of other losses. Her father, her sister Helene, her mother, and her younger sister Sophie Charlotte.
So much grief piled on top of each other.
It's heartbreaking. And after Rudolph's death, she primarily wore black for the rest of her life, a constant symbol of her mourning, with a possible exception of a light blue and cream dress discovered later. To make matters worse, Count Gyula Andrassy, the man she considered her closest confidant, her last and only friend, as she put it, he passed away in 1890.
So she's not just grieving her son, she's grieving multiple family members and her closest friend.
It was a period of profound isolation. But strangely, despite her withdrawal from court duties and her solitary travels, the public's fascination with Elizabeth seemed to intensify after marrying.
Almost like the mystery surrounding her, it grew even stronger.
She became even more an enigma, an iconic figure shrouded in sadness. And she actively cultivated that image, using a white leather parasol and a fan to shield her face from the prying eyes of the public and the press.
Almost as if she was both seeking and rejecting the spotlight at the same time.
It's a fascinating contradiction. And then there's her increasingly obsessive pursuit of physical perfection and beauty. This became a defining characteristic of her later years.
Right, the image of Sissi that many people have, it's the beautiful empress with the incredibly long hair, the tiny waist.
It's the image that's endured. And she worked incredibly hard to maintain it. Even though she was unusually tall for the time, about 5'8", she kept her weight remarkably consistent, around 110 pounds, for most of her adult life.
That's dedication.
It was, through a strict regimen of fasting and exercise. Gymnastics, horseback riding for hours on end. These weren't just hobbies for her. They were a way to exert control over her body, over her life.
To shape herself literally.
Exactly. And the sources detail some pretty extreme behaviors. After her daughter Sophie's death, she apparently refused to eat for days. And this pattern, it reemerged during other periods of deep sadness.
Using food, or the lack of food, as a way to cope.
Right. She routinely skipped family dinners, and when she did eat, it was very sparingly. If her weight went above her self-imposed limit, she would go on these fasting cures.
Fasting cures, huh?
They could involve near total starvation or extremely restrictive diets.
Like what? What would she eat?
Sometimes just milk and eggs, or even juice from half-raw beef steak.
Oh, yikes.
It's pretty extreme. And then there's the tight lacing.
Oh, yeah, that's legendary.
To an almost unbelievable degree. At one point, her waist was reportedly reduced to a mere 16 inches.
16 inches? How is that even possible?
Through custom-made leather corsets, incredibly tightly laced. It apparently horrified her mother-in-law. And even in her later years, her waist remained incredibly small, something like 18.5 to 19.5 inches. She was described as being almost inhumanly slender.
It's both fascinating and disturbing at the same time.
It is, and she reportedly developed a strong aversion to women she perceived as overweight. This attitude, it seems, she passed on to her youngest daughter, Marie Valerie.
Oh.
And her fashion choices, they also reflected this obsession with slenderness.
Right. She pioneered this more streamlined silhouette, rejecting those big poofy dresses that were popular at the time.
Yes. She ditched the hoop skirts and went for a more simple writing-inspired style, often monochromatic. She wasn't into flashy accessories or constantly changing outfits like many other royals did. There are even stories of her refusing to wear petticoats and being sewn into her clothes to achieve that super sleek look.
So the image, the control, it was all very carefully curated.
It was. And her exercise routine, it was just as intense. Every residence she had, it had a dedicated gymnasium.
Like a personal gym in every palace.
In every palace. And even in her private bedroom, she had mats, balance beams. She took up fencing in her 50s. And she was an incredibly skilled horsewoman, often riding for hours each day. And when sciatica made riding too painful later in life, she replaced it with these ridiculously long, demanding walks and hikes.
So she was always on the move, always pushing herself physically.
Always. It's like she couldn't sit still. And in her later years, this focus on her physique, it became even more obsessive. She would weigh herself multiple times a day, take regular steam baths. By 1894, her weight had dropped to a dangerously low level. And there are these tantalizing hints of possible binge eating episodes.
Binge eating?
There's an unconfirmed story about her visiting a restaurant incognito and just eating a ton of food.
Sneaking out for a secret feast.
It's fascinating, right? And there's that story about a secret spiral staircase she had built in her English country house, leading directly from her bedroom to the kitchen.
Oh, wow. So maybe there was this hidden side to her relationship with food.
There might have been. A lot of historians now suggest that her behavior is consistent with a restrictive eating disorder, possibly even anorexia nervosa. It adds a whole other dimension to her story, doesn't it?
It does. It's both sad and I don't know, I guess it makes her even more human in a way.
Yes, it does. But alongside these struggles, there was the undeniable fact of her beauty. She was considered one of the most beautiful women in 19th century Europe, and her hair, her famously long, thick hair, it was a huge part of that image.
I mean, 3 hours of care every day.
3 hours. It reached an extraordinary length. It said she even complained of headaches from the sheer weight of her braids. Talk about a commitment to beauty.
No pain, no gain, right? Or in this case, no paint, no perfect hair.
And her personal hairdresser, Franziska Pfeifferlich, she had to follow a strict protocol. White gloves, every single fallen hair had to be presented to the Empress in a silver bowl. They washed her hair only every 2 weeks, using this special mixture of eggs and cognac.
Eggs and cognac.
Eggs and cognac. It was this whole elaborate ritual that took an entire day.
Wow, that's a production.
It was. And she was very particular about her gray hairs. Pfeifferlich had to tweeze them out, every single one, until Rudolph's death. After that, she just let them be. Later in life, her hair was described as still abundant, but with, streaks of silver running through it.
It's kind of a poignant detail, isn't it?
It is. And, it's amazing how she used all that time spent on her hair productively. She used it to learn languages. She was already fluent in English and French, and she added modern Greek to her repertoire.
While getting her hair done.
While getting her hair done. Her Greek tutor, Konstantin Christomanos, he describes the whole hairdressing process as almost a ritual.
It's almost like a meditation, isn't it?
Yeah, it's fascinating. He recounts her saying that her mind could escape through her hair.
Through her hair.
It's such a vivid image. But despite all this focus on her appearance, she actually preferred a more natural look when it came to makeup and perfume. She used them sparingly, but she did experiment with a lot of beauty products, and she had these very specific, demanding night and bedtime routines.
Like what? Give us the details.
Well, for starters, she slept without a pillow, on a hard metal bedstead.
Metal bedstead.
No fluffy pillows for the Empress. And then she would apply a facial mask made of either raw veal or crushed strawberries.
Raw veal.
Held in place by leather, no less. And she'd get these intense massages, apply cloth soaked in violet or cider vinegar to her hips.
All this to maintain her beauty.
And to top it off, she would wrap her neck in Kummerfeld tone washing water and take daily cold showers. A habit, by the way, that later aggravated her arthritis.
So she was literally putting herself through physical discomfort in the pursuit of beauty.
And she hated being photographed, especially later in life. She would use her fan or a sunshade to shield her face from the cameras.
So even with her beauty, she was trying to control how it was seen, how it was captured.
Exactly. It was all about maintaining a certain image, a certain mystique. And then there's the travel. Travel was such a central part of Elizabeth's life, especially in her later years.
Yeah, she was always on the move.
Always. She had her own imperial steamer, the Miramar. She frequented all these glamorous spots, Cape Martin, San Remo, Lake Geneva, Bad Ischl, her beloved Corfu. But she also ventured to places that were, well, a little less typical for European royalty.
Like, where did she go?
Morocco, Algeria, Malta, Turkey, Egypt. Places that weren't exactly on the royal tourist trail.
She sounds adventurous.
She was. There's this quote about her and travel that I think really sums it up. She said, "If I arrived at a place and knew that I could never leave it again, the whole stay would become hell despite being paradise."
So she needed that freedom, that ability to move on whenever she felt like it.
Absolutely. Being tied down, it was her worst nightmare. After Rudolph's death, she had the Achillean Palace built on Corfu. It was meant to be this personal sanctuary,
Her escape.
but she eventually lost interest in it. The palace later became associated with Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany and is now a museum in Greece.
So even her sanctuary, it couldn't hold her for too long.
It seems not. Her travels, her diet, her exercise routine, her fashion choices, they were all constantly reported on in the newspapers. It was like she was a 19th century celebrity.
The paparazzi of the day.
Exactly. And there were rumors of romantic involvements, too, with the English horseman, George Bay Middleton, for example.
Ooh, scandalous.
Although there's no concrete evidence to support those claims. And interestingly, she actually encouraged her husband's relationship with the actress Katharina Schret.
So she was okay with her husband having, let's say, a companion.
It seems so. Maybe it was a way for them to maintain their own separate lives within the confines of their marriage. To avoid all the attention, she often traveled incognito, using pseudonyms like Countess of Hohenems.
The woman of many names.
She even refused to meet with other monarchs if she didn't want to, and her walking tours, they were legendary.
I've heard about those, like super fast, super long.
They were. She would often do them with her Greek tutors or ladies-in-waiting, like Countess Irma Stare. The Countess described her as reclusive, deeply sensitive, natural, liberal in her views, remarkably modest, a keen listener, and highly intelligent.
It's quite a description.
It is. And here's a fun fact. When she was in Greece at the age of 51, she got a tattoo.
A tattoo. Sissi got a tattoo.
She did. An anchor tattoo on her shoulder.
I would love to see a picture of that.
Unfortunately, no photos exist. In her later years, her travel companions were often young Greeks. The memoirs of one of them, Constantine Christomanos, they were actually banned by the Viennese court.
Banned. Why?
They were considered too revealing, too intimate, and sadly, it was during one of her travels that her life came to a tragic end.
In Geneva in 1898.
Right. She was 60 years old, and despite warnings about potential dangers, she traveled there incognito. But her presence was eventually discovered.
It's almost impossible to stay hidden when you're an empress.
It is. On September 10th, while walking with Countess Sissi to catch a steamship, she was attacked by an Italian anarchist named Luigi Luciani.
Luciani, yeah. He'd initially planned to kill the Duke of Orleans, but changed his target when he learned Elizabeth was in Geneva.
He saw it as an act of propaganda of the deed, striking a blow against the monarchy.
And the weapon he used, it was pretty brutal.
A sharpened needle file. He stabbed her with it.
And what's remarkable is that she didn't die instantly.
No. She collapsed, but was helped to her feet and even managed to walk to the steamship before collapsing again.
The adrenaline must have been pumping.
The boat captain, unaware of her identity, advised them to return to the hotel. It was only when Countess Sissi noticed a blood stain on Elizabeth's dress and realized she was unconscious that her true identity was revealed.
So there's this moment of mistaken identity, this delay that could have potentially, changed things.
It's a chilling thought. The boat turned back and Elizabeth was rushed to the hotel, but it was too late. She was pronounced dead a short time later.
A senseless act of violence that ended a truly remarkable life.
It was. Franz Joseph, when he heard the news, he was devastated. Initially, he feared that Elizabeth had taken her own life. He was actually, in a grim way, relieved to learn it was an assassination.
Wow.
He ordered a full autopsy, which revealed that the file had pierced her heart, causing a slow, fatal hemorrhage. And the fact that she could walk after the attack, it was attributed to the pressure from her incredibly tight corset, which temporarily stemmed the bleeding.
Wow. So her obsession with her figure, it may have actually, in a way, contributed to her death.
It's a strange twist of fate. The photograph of the wound and the autopsy instruments, they were later destroyed on Franz Joseph's orders.
Almost like he wanted to erase that final image.
Perhaps. Her funeral procession in Vienna was a huge event, but there was some controversy. Initially, her coffin was inscribed with Elizabeth, Empress of Austria. People were outraged that her title as Queen of Hungary was missing.
Yeah, they had to quickly add that in.
They did. It just shows how deeply she was connected to Hungary, even in death.
And Luciani. What happened to him?
He was caught quickly, and the broken file was found. He bragged about acting alone, but there were initial concerns about a larger conspiracy. Vienna was on edge, there were threats against Italians, and there was a lot of public anger about the lack of security for the Empress, although it's worth noting that she had specifically requested the withdrawal of police surveillance. She valued her privacy.
She wanted to move freely, even if it meant taking risks.
It seems so. Luciani's trial took place in Geneva, and despite his desire for the death penalty, he was ultimately sentenced to life in prison. He later died by suicide. Franz Joseph, he was heartbroken, bewildered. He couldn't understand how anyone could want to harm someone like Elizabeth, who he believed had never hurt anyone.
Yeah, in his eyes, she was almost a saint.
In a way, yes. Elizabeth's will, it stipulated that most of her jewelry should be sold, with the proceeds going to religious and charitable organizations. Her remaining personal possessions, they were left to her granddaughter. And the assassination had ripple effects across Europe. It contributed to the convening of the International Conference of Rome for the Social Defense Against Anarchists, which was a key step in the fight against terrorism.
So even in death, she had an impact on the world.
She did. And her legacy, well, it's vast. Franz Joseph established the Order of Elizabeth in her memory. There are memorials and statues dedicated to her in Switzerland, Austria, Slovakia, Hungary. Countless chapels and parks bear her name. Several of her residences are now museums.
Keeping her memory alive.
Places like her apartments in the Hofburg Schönbrunn Palace, the Hermes Villa, the Achillean, and in Hungary there are entire districts of Budapest, bridges over the Danube, all named after her.
It's like a physical manifestation of her enduring presence.
Even a railway sleeping car she used is preserved in a museum in Vienna.
A train car. That's cool.
And then there's the Sissi star, a diamond and pearl jewel she often wore. It was stolen and later recovered, adding to the mythology surrounding her.
And then, of course, there are the countless artistic portrayals, the operetta Sissi, the musical Elizabeth, ballets, movies. There's that famous Sissi trilogy with Romy Schneider, Visconti's Ludwig, and more recent films like Corsage and Sissi and I. TV shows, books, even songs.
Which Tyler's story has taken.